Okay, here we are again. Now let's get back to where we were. So last time we were talking about GDP. And so let me just get, hold on one second. Let me get Moodle open and then we'll get started. Oops. All right, here we go. God, with this thing in the way, I can't see anything. Hold on. All right. Any second now. All right, so yes, chapter 5 is our discussion about GDP. We weren't completely done with it yet, so we'll carry on there. We'll probably finish that today, and then we'll pick it up with chapter 6. And since we're going to be done with chapter 5 today, what I'd like to do is look at the chapter 5 problem set on Friday. Okay, so the chapter 5 problem set has us calculate GDP for small economy. Let's take a quick look at it. So imagine a country that's so small that all they make is coffee and milk. All right, well, those are pretty good products. And so what we're going to have you do is calculate the nominal and the real GDP for both 2019 and 2020. And then we're also going to use this chart to help us calculate the size of GDP for this economy in the year 2020. Okay, so I've thrown a bunch of information here. You don't need all of it, by the way. Some of these are meant for the incomes approach, but we're going to use the expenditures approach. So in other words, interest, for example, is not part of the expenditures approach, so you just leave it out. Okay, so just use the ones that are relevant for the expenditures approach. So between the two of these, we'll get some good practice learning how to calculate GDP. So, and that will also come in useful in later chapters where we start talking about inflation and how high prices are going. So let's do that on Friday because we'll be done with chapter 5 today. And in the meantime, let me get 5 open. Now, let me just see where we left off. Oh, wait a minute. What did I do? This would be, yes, here it is. Okay. Oh, Fernando, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that we stopped at watching the videos.
Oh, right. We got to see, I'm glad you reminded me. Yes, the last video we looked at would have been real GDP per capita, I believe. So yeah, that's right. So we have nominal versus real and limitations of GDP, which we'll look at today as soon as we're done with chapter 5. These next two are from chapter 6, so we'll save those for later. All right, so I think we're all caught up. So real GDP versus nominal. Let's just remind ourselves what that even means. Whenever you see the word nominal, that means what is going on right now in current dollars or current prices. So in other words, nominal GDP means if you added up the value of all the goods and services that we're producing in 2021, without making any adjustments for inflation, the total you get is called nominal. That's what you're actually seeing in the real world. Real means we're adjusting our nominal for inflation. And basically what that means is that you're converting all the prices into the prices of a previous year, and that previous year is known as the base year. So in other words, this is the only way to be sure that when GDP grows, that it is output that is growing, not prices. All right, now usually when GDP grows, there's some increase in prices and there's some increase in output. We'd like to be able to figure out how much of our increase in GDP is coming from the actual increase in the output of goods and services. So that's why this is important, because this way we can see how much the economy is actually growing over time. So that's why most policymaking is based on real GDP rather than nominal GDP, because this is the one that tells us how much output is actually growing. And of course, if output is growing, that also means that standards of living are growing because incomes are going up. All right, so as long as output is growing, incomes are rising, and our standards of living are increasing as well. But the only way to be sure of that is to look at real GDP. Nominal, again, can go up because of inflation, but also it can go up because of actual output increases. So this is the one that isolates just the increase in output. So that's why this is so important. Now, by the way, the word real can be applied in other areas as well. For example, in a later chapter, we'll see we can make a distinction between real and nominal interest rates. And there are other areas where we can apply this distinction as well. But here, we want to focus on GDP. And so we're about to look at an example to see how we calculate both nominal and real GDP. All right, and once you see the actual numerical examples, this will make a lot more sense. Right now, it sounds very abstract, but we're going to understand a lot more what this is all about. So let's assume that there's a small economy that only produces wine and cheese. Let's say it's some tiny little island country off the coast of France, and that's all they make, wine and cheese. And so this chart is telling us how much wine they made and how much it cost. So for example, in 2019, the country made 950 gallons of wine that were worth $10 a gallon. In the same year, they made 450 pounds of cheese, worth $5 each. Then the following year, you'll notice wine production went up from 950 to 1,000. And the price, though, did go up to $11 a gallon. With the cheese, the output actually fell a little bit from 450 to 400 pounds, and the price went up. So the question is, did we produce more output in 2020 or in 2019? If it did go up in 2020, how much did it go up? Okay, so anyway, how would we do this? Let's make an assumption now. Suppose that the government's statistical agency has decided that going forward, 2019 will be our base year. That means in the future, all calculations for real GDP will be based on 2019 prices. All right, so let's see how this works. So nominal GDP is computed with present or current year prices and present year quantities. Real GDP, on the other hand, is also produced with present year quantities, but the difference is that it is using base year prices. Okay, that's the key distinction. Okay, so why don't we do some calculations? Let's take a look at how we would calculate nominal GDP. Now, you know what? Let's see, I don't think we can have both of these open at the same time. That would be kind of nice. But just be aware that for nominal 2019, what we're doing is we're taking the dollar value of the wine, which is $9,500. Oh, hold on. Yeah, okay, here we go. All right, so in other words, to calculate, we want to calculate the dollar value of the wine. And that equals $10 times 950, which is 9,500. Then we have to calculate the dollar value of the cheese. And so, of course, that means we're multiplying $5 by 450. Which is 2250. So that means that GDP, nominal GDP in 2019 is the sum of those two, 11,750. Okay, in other words, if you add these two up, 9,500 plus 2,250 is 11,750. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? You're basically just saying, listen, what is the dollar value of what we produced in this year? You multiply the price per unit times the number of units. So the value of the wine is 9,500. The value of the cheese is 2,250. The grand total is 2019 nominal GDP. That's what we actually produced that year using those prices. Okay, now, what about 2020? So in 2020, we do the same thing except with the new numbers. And we've got 11 times 1,000 or $11,000. Now that sounds like a good thing. You notice how the value of the wine went up, but some of that at least is caused by higher prices. So it's, it's hard to say just yet whether that represents an increase in GDP or not, because you notice we get more wine, but it's also more expensive. And then look at the cheese. We actually made less cheese. Okay, so anyway, the total there for 2020, so this is, by the way, 2019 nominal GDP. Over here, I'll add these up, 11,000 plus 2,400 is 13,400. Yes, Fernando.
Quick question. Just by looking at 2019 and 2020, you said that for the cheese we made less than for the wine, but just from comparing it, isn't it a good thing that like from the cheese from 2019 we made more profit than we did on the last year? Like, wouldn't that be a good thing?
What we're trying to figure out is not the profits. We're trying to figure out the dollar value of what we produce. In other words, when customers buy these products, this is how much they're paying for it. So the cheese, if you notice, here's the problem with the nominal GDP right here. The dollar value of the cheese went up, but that's only because the price went up. We actually have less cheese available in the economy at a higher price. So in that sense, even though the number's higher, that means that we're worse off than we were the year before, at least as far as the cheese goes. So this is why the nominal GDP can be very deceiving. So you can see it actually did go up from 11,750 to 13,400, which sounds like a lot. In fact, if you calculated the percentage difference there, let me just quickly get out my calculator and do that for you. It would sound like, oh my God, the economy is really booming because the nominal GDP is growing so fast. Okay, that represents an increase of 14%. If the economy really grew that fast, that would be unbelievable. So the percentage increase, which by the way, let me show you how this is done. What you're doing is you're taking the new GDP minus the old GDP, and then you're dividing that by the old GDP. And that works out to be almost exactly 14%. Now, of course, we know that that doesn't mean that we produce 14% more goods and services. Clearly, that can't be right because while we made a little bit more wine, we made less cheese during the year. So there's some of that at least is coming from higher prices or inflation. It does not reflect accurately any increase in our standards of living. So we have to make the adjustments to these two numbers to come up with a real GDP. And that will give us a better sense of how much the economy is really growing. Okay. Oh, I just noticed there's some chats. Sorry. Yes, profits are good, but is the output for the entire economy growing? That's what we're really after. Anyway, and also, we can't even tell if the profits are going up because if the price of the cheese goes up, by $1, it might be because the cost of making the cheese went up by $1. And that if that happened, then the profits don't go up either. So this is not a good thing to see that the cheese output is going down. That means the economy is somehow less productive than it was the year before. And that's a very bad sign. Now, as far as real goes, we're going to do one thing that's different. A very important difference is that we're still using the current quantities, but we're only going to use base year prices. Okay, now let's see. Hold on one second. Let me make another copy of this table. And let me just erase all this writing so we can start again. That's gonna, oh God. It's a bit of a nuisance, but maybe I'll just use the eraser. Yeah, this technology, it works okay up to a point. It's a bit of a headache. All right, so this time around, when we calculate the GDP, we're only going to be focused on the prices in the base year, which is 2019. But we're going to use the quantities in whatever year we happen to be in. So for example, the 2019 real GDP will actually be the same as the nominal because it's the same prices. So the base year GDP, I should say the base year real GDP just equals the base year nominal GDP. So we don't actually have to do any calculations. It's when we get to 2020 that there will be some important changes. So the wine, if you come over here, you'll see that in 2020, we made 1,000 gallons of wine, but we're going to use the 2019 price of $10. And then we're trying to figure out 2020 real GDP here. Down here, we have 400 pounds of cheese. We're going to use the 2019 price of 5. You notice the quantities are from the current year, but the prices are from the base year. Okay, so that's 2,000. So that means that this GDP is $12,000. This year, if you recall, it was 11,750. So when we use the base year prices for everything, the GDP is actually only going up from 11,750 to 12,000. Okay, so that's what this is all about. Now, that's not nearly as impressive. The percentage increase is quite a bit smaller. So as usual, we'll take the new GDP minus the old and divide by the old. And this is a very small percentage. Let's see, this is equal to about 2.1%. So basically, what's happened here is that nominal, let me just type this in. You're right, there it is, 2.13. So nominal went up by 14%, roughly. Oh boy, hold on. It's being a little stubborn with me today. So nominal GDP increased by about 14%. Real GDP increased by about 2.1%. What this means is, first of all, inflation in 2020 was approximately, and this is only approximate, the difference between the two, which is 11.9%, So this means that output only grew by 2.1%, and therefore standards of living only grew by 2.1%. In other words, we have access to 2.1% more goods and services than we did the year before. So you can see in this example, the difference between the two is quite considerable. But that's because that inflation rate is really high. Very few countries in the world have inflation rates that are that high right now. Most countries are down in the single digits. Like the US until recently, it was about 2%. And most of Western Europe is a little higher than that. Japan, it's almost zero. Japan's inflation rate has been close to zero for like 30 years. They just don't have inflation over there. But it's normal for inflation to be in the low single digits for most countries. But then there's always some that have higher inflation rates. But this way, you can see why this is so important. Because if you said, oh, wow, GDP nominal went up 14%, we must be really doing well. Well, no, it just means that prices went up so much that our actual output only went up by about 2.1%, which is still not bad. As a matter of fact, it turns out that in practice, anything around 3, or let's say 3 or so, let me just add this here. Over the long run, an economy should be able to, or let's put it this way, if real GDP grows by about 3% per year, this will prevent unemployment from rising and will not stimulate further inflation. In other words, this is more or less what the economy is capable of doing without inflation rising. And it also will make sure that unemployment doesn't rise, because as the economy grows, there will be more and more jobs out there. So the policymakers, which we'll discuss a lot later on in the course, by which I mean Congress and the president and the Federal Reserve System, this is what they're hoping to see. Roughly 3% per year, maybe 4. Anything beyond that, you might start to see a little bit of inflation. If it falls below 3, then that often is accompanied by an increase in unemployment, which we don't want either. Okay. Well, what it's saying to us is we need to focus on actual output of goods and services, not so much the dollar amounts, but what is being produced. So you can imagine in a society where productivity is growing quickly, we can produce more and more goods and services with the same resources. And that's a society where standards of living will grow very quickly. Okay, so productivity is an important part of all this. The reason why the economy grows is because we're continuously investing in new and better equipment and technology and methods for creating goods and services. And so more and more can be produced with the same amount of labor and capital and land. And that's how standards of living go up. And of course, this is extremely obvious in the tech sector. I mean, if you look at the computer that you have now compared to 5 years ago, it's quite a bit more improved, isn't it? And yet the price didn't really go up, did it? How is this possible? Because productivity and technology are going up so quickly. So here, remember the real GDP, the focus is on what's being produced. And so as that grows, the standards of living can grow as well. Okay, so that's our focus here. Anyway, so this is what we're aiming for. Now, 3% sounds pretty small. You might say, well, that's not much. But at a 3% growth rate, standards of living will double roughly every 25 years, or basically one generation. So in other words, imagine the size of the economy doubling every 25 years. That means every new generation that comes along, the economy is twice as big as it was for their parents. And so that actually is a very rapid growth rate. And so this is what we're hoping for. So now, of course, in the last year or two, our economic growth was grotesquely distorted by COVID. before the COVID came along, we were growing at a very strong pace and the economy was absolutely booming. And then this wretched COVID came along. And so now we're still trying to recover from it. But we have a lot of hopeful signs that the economy is bouncing back from what essentially was a disaster. But once this is over, we can probably go back to growing very quickly again, hopefully without a lot of inflation. But that depends on policymakers in Washington not making the wrong decisions, because you can easily blow it here. If you do the wrong things, you can easily slow down the recovery, or you can cause a lot of inflation. But again, we'll talk about that in later chapters. Anyway, so right now our focus is on how to actually calculate GDP. Now, I did mention that in the base year, nominal and real will be equal to each other because they're using the same prices. So what that means then is that if you were to draw a plot, let's say, of both nominal and real GDP over time, let's say I drew one plot for nominal GDP. And then real would look something like this. Where they cross is the base year. Okay, so in other words, once we get past the base year, nominal will be greater than real, but in prior years, it'll be the other way around. Okay, now I do want to mention one thing though. This is only true as long as inflation is positive, which is almost always the case. You very rarely see negative inflation. It does occasionally happen, but it's rare. So as long as inflation is positive, meaning that prices are rising, this is the relationship you'll expect to see between nominal and real. So anytime past the base year, nominal will be higher than real, but prior to that, it'll be lower. It'll be the other way around. Now, by the way, as long as we're on the subject of positive inflation, if inflation is negative, now this is something we'll discuss further in the inflation chapter, but inflation can technically be negative, although, like I said, it's extremely unusual. Negative inflation is called deflation, and it happens rarely. Okay, in the US, deflation, well, let's put it this way, the US last experienced deflation during the Depression in the 30s. In recent years, Japan has occasionally experienced deflation. Now, of course, it's not surprising. Their inflation rate is so close to zero that occasionally it dips into negative territory, but their inflation rate usually hovers around zero. And so once in a while, it slips into negative territory. But for the most part, throughout the world, it's very unusual to have deflation. Yes, Fernando.
So just to ask, if that's the case, would that mean like for Japan, they have like a positive inflation? Like it's not like passing more than like their standard of the inflation level?
Well, their inflation is so close to zero that you're right on the edge. You're right on the cusp there. You're like sitting on the. It's like you're sitting on a wall, and you could fall on either side very easily. So it's a very unusual thing, but they do occasionally have it. Just because in a normal year, their inflation is close to zero anyway. So all it would take is for a few prices to fall substantially, and the overall inflation rate becomes negative. In fact, we could probably find a chart on the internet. Maybe we'll do this. See if we can find a chart that shows inflation rates in different countries. Just to get a feel for what numbers we're looking at. Now, okay. Now up here, you're seeing 676% in Zimbabwe. That's unusual. Okay, it happens. Okay, you see these high inflation rates. That's very unusual. Let's see if we can find, oh boy. Well, inflation is in Venezuela is pushing 10,000%, but their economy is in it's completely collapsed in the last few years. They're in the middle of a severe crisis. So no, oh, here we go. Oh no, what happened? Oh, this is terrible. We right there, we were supposed to have a chart and it's got all this crap here. Some of these small countries apparently are currently experiencing deflation. Like I see Switzerland on the list because their inflation rate is usually very, all right, we better go somewhere else. Inflation is quite low. All right, maybe we can get it from here. Yeah, I was kind of hoping to see, all right, maybe this will do. They don't seem to be in any particular order, which is pretty annoying. Oh, this might. All right. Oh boy. Okay. Well, this is going to prove to be harder than I expected. So, you know what? Maybe we could do this. Let's go to Fred, our old friend Fred. Yeah, sometimes finding stuff in the internet can be a bigger headache than you might realize. See what our inflation rate has looked like throughout history. Okay, now this is only going up to about 2020. Right now, inflation is starting to spike up again, but you can see that this is zero. Now, very briefly, there was a crisis in the 2007, 2008, 2009 involving real estate, where real estate prices were collapsing. And when a crisis like that breaks out, you might see prices start to fall. Here, according to this, we're temporarily negative, but it didn't last for very long. These numbers they're hovering around 2. Sometimes they go below, sometimes they go above. This is normal. See, this is going back to the early 80s. Pretty much inflation has hovered around 2% during this period. But there was a period in the 70s when it got really ridiculous. Around here, look at that, 13.5% in the United States. Can you imagine that? That was a rough time. Everything was going wrong in the world at that time. And so inflation started to spike up. But you can see what actually had to happen, we'll discuss this in a later chapter, but the central bank, the Federal Reserve System, had to change the way they conduct monetary policy to squeeze inflation out of the economy. And you can see they were very successful, but for about 3 or 4 years, the unemployment rate was absolutely astronomical, but it did work. And since then, it's been pretty stable. Although unfortunately now it's starting to bounce back again. So why don't we see if we can do this for Japan? They don't necessarily have foreign data for every single country. I mean, after all, it's meant to be for the United States, but they do have others. Here it is. Now look at this. That black line is 0. So you can see what I'm talking about. It drifts down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. It's always right on the cusp of 0. And sometimes it sneaks down to negative territory. Then it starts to climb up again, but it's always right there. This is going back to the late 80s. They had their own real estate crisis in the late 80s. And ever since then, their economic growth has been fairly slow, and their inflation rate has been right around 0. Okay, so it's right there. So they do sometimes have deflation. Okay, so anyway, but that's unusual. I guess if we looked at Switzerland, we might see something similar. But like I said, that is definitely not normal. Yeah, oh my God. In some years, their deflation rate was quite high. Look at that, minus 1.1. Although it's happening less frequently than in Japan, they do occasionally have negative inflation. Well, you know, some countries are just prone to having low inflation rates like this. But they've, oh man, look at how high it was back here. By their standards, that was quite high. But anyway, now what we want to do next is look at GDP in the US. Notice I specifically asked for real. Now, this is going to be a very boring chart because it's just going to go, yeah. It only dips down during a recession. Now, this, of course, is the COVID right here. That evil COVID reduced our economic growth by quite a bit, and but now it's coming back. Now, I think let's see if we can do this. It might be more interesting to look at growth rates rather than the actual level of GDP. But by the way, let me go back here for a second. Let's say here we're up around 20 trillion. Here we're at 6 trillion. Now that's 40 years ago, but still the economy has more than tripled in 40 years. That's a lot of growth. In fact, I'm going to take out my calculator and see what that averages out to. Let's say that the economy is about tripled. That averages, oh no, something's wrong. I did something terribly wrong. Hold on a second. No, my calculator is not cooperating with me. Hold on one second. Okay, about 2.8% per year. That's been the average. That includes all the ups and downs, all the recessions, all the boom periods. So over those last 40 years, the economy in real terms has grown roughly at 2.8%. So we said before that 3% is a good target. We haven't quite achieved that, but it's been very close. So you can see that's a big increase. And remember, this is real GDP. So that means our standards of living have roughly tripled since the 80s. And that's pretty impressive. Not bad, huh? Okay. So anyway, now, okay, so now we understand the differences between real and nominal and why it's so important, but we also want to understand why the GDP measure itself is not a perfect measure of standards of living. It has several problems associated with it, as you can probably imagine. And we started to talk about this last time, but what is wrong with GDP, the GDP measure? Now, by the way, this is true of all countries. This is not unique to the United States. Every country has its own statistical agencies that calculate their GDP, and they run into more or less the same problems. Number one, it doesn't include everything. What is it missing? The values of goods and services that are not sold in a market, the values of goods and services that are not reported, meaning to the IRS, and illegal activities. Nobody finds out about these, and so therefore they're not counted. Okay, so now what do we mean by not sold in a market? If you perform services for yourself or for other people and no money changes hands, then it does not appear in the GDP accounts because how could it? Nobody knows. If you go next door and help your neighbor fix his car and just for as a favor, that same service might have cost $100 at a garage, but because no cash changed hands, this is not going to appear in the GDP accounts. And of course, if you do things for yourself, you fix your own car, you clean the house, whatever you do for yourself is not going to get counted in GDP. It has to revolve around a market transaction where dollars change hands. Not reported. Well, let's see. Now, what happens if, for example, you work off the books? Let's say a construction company hires you during the summer and they say, here's money. Don't tell anyone about this, but here's your paid. It's not a check, it's cash. Just slip it in your pocket and forget about it. That is what we mean by the quote underground economy, where economic activity is taking place and there are cash payments, but nobody finds out about it, specifically the IRS. Or like you hear about this all the time, like if you're a waiter and I don't know exactly how that works. You're supposed to take the tips and you're supposed to write down in your taxes how many tips you got. I'm guessing that it doesn't always work out that way. So the tips that are not reported would, of course, not end up in the GDP accounts. And yes, off the books for a construction company. And of course, no illegal activities will ever be reported. Can you imagine? Do you think the crooks put their illegal gains on their tax forms? I don't think so. So none of this gets discovered and it does not get counted. So basically, it's understood that the GDP measures understate the true value of all the economic activity in the economy. Now, some economists have tried to estimate what percentage this represents. It's obviously a very difficult thing to do, but let's see if we can find something about this. Now, this is coming from Investopedia, which is a very reliable source. They're claiming that it's about 11 to 12% of our GDP is being not counted. So in other words, we're understating it, according to this, by about $2.5 trillion, which is being missed. Okay, now, of course, that's just an estimate. Nobody knows that for sure, but that's what they came up with. Now, as it turns out, this number is going to be higher in other countries, especially countries that have high taxes or that have a totalitarian type of government like Cuba or Venezuela, because people have a very powerful incentive not to tell the government anything. So, or in a high tax country like Sweden, let's see if we have a number for them. Sweden has always had notoriously high taxes. Theirs is, let's see what they have. Okay, I'm guessing that those are those percentages? I guess those are the percentages that are being missed. It's not that different than the US, surprisingly enough. But yeah, because let's face it, in countries that have high taxes, people have a more powerful incentive to avoid reporting their income. Now, what else? Now, obviously, we're using it as a measure of standards of living, but of course, we can't capture anything that's non-numerical. In other words, yes, having more income is certainly helping with your lifestyle, but there can be other issues that we're not properly capturing. For example, in a country like China, where they're growing like crazy, the policy of the government is to grow as fast as possible. Unfortunately, what's happening in a lot of areas is that it also means that they're getting a lot of pollution as a result. And so that kind of thing isn't being picked up in the GDP accounts. Now, fortunately, that's not really such a problem here, but in China, their GDP measures really need to be taken with a grain of salt because in a lot of ways, they're also damaging their own environment by growing so fast. So, again, you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt. But in general, this is still considered to be the best measure we have of how well a society is doing, how well, what are our standards of living looking like. So yes, economists are constantly working on these measures and trying to improve them. But, in spite of all of this, it's really the best that we have. Okay, so yeah, well, it's just difficult to do this properly. And of course, one of the challenges here is that the US economy is so massive that you can easily imagine that information may not all become available quickly. And in fact, the way these numbers are reported, they come out every month and they have to be revised 3 times before the government can say, yes, this is the actual number, because there's so much information involved and they have to sort through it all and calculate it and organize it and put it together. So it usually takes about 3 months before they're satisfied that, yes, this is the correct value. And you'll see that in the media. They'll say, well, the first quarter growth was revised upward by 2% or downward by 2%, because it takes so long to calculate these numbers, just because the size of the economy is so massive. All right, well, anyway, with all that being said, I think it's time for our videos of the day. We'll start with nominal versus real, and then we'll look at the limitations of GDP, and then we can get started with chapter 6, which is about unemployment, as you see. Okay, so let's look at this one first. No, let me stop it here. And then I'll send you the link as usual. Oops. All right, let's check this out.
Is the economy growing? Are people better off today than they were 4 years ago? What about 40 years ago? The GDP statistic can help us to answer all of these questions. But first, we do need to make some modifications. As we discussed in our first video, GDP sums up the prices of all finished goods and services. So that means that there are 2 ways that GDP can increase. First, prices can increase. In this case, the GDP number goes up, but the economy isn't actually producing more goods and services. It's inflation, which is driving the higher GDP. The increase in GDP, it might look good on paper, but it's a mirage, a nominal increase only. The other way that GDP can increase is if we do produce more valuable goods and services. And that could mean simply more goods and services, or better goods and services, more highly valued goods and services. It's this second type of increase in GDP that we want. This isn't a mirage. This is a real increase in GDP. Real GDP measures the second type of growth. And the real GDP statistic, it controls for inflation by adding up all the goods and services produced in an economy using the same set of prices over time, the same set of prices. Real GDP tells us if the prices of goods and services hadn't changed, how much would GDP have increased or decreased? Real GDP, it's typically what we really care about. Let's give an example. We'll be using a fantastic tool called the St. Louis Federal Reserve Economic Database, or FRED. FRED is every economist's best friend. So let's Google US nominal GDP FRED. Here's what we get. We can see that we have grown from a GDP in 1950 of $320 billion to a GDP in 2015 of over $17 trillion. Wow. That suggests that our economy has gotten 55 times bigger. But hold on, wait a moment, you might say. My grandmother told me that a loaf of bread used to cost $0.10, and now it costs a couple of dollars. That's right. If we want to compare our economy over time, we need to control for changes in prices. So we don't want to look at nominal GDP. We're more interested in real GDP. So let's Google real US GDP FRED. Here's what we get. This graph measures real GDP in 2009 dollars. That means using 2009 prices. This graph tells us that using 2009 prices consistently, that in 1950, all the goods and services produced at that time were worth about $2 trillion. In comparison, in 2015, all the goods and services produced at that time were worth about $16 trillion. So while nominal GDP says that the economy is 55 times bigger in 2015 than in 1950, real GDP shows us that it's 8 times bigger. That's still pretty good, but a big difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Okay, so now we've controlled for prices, but there's another big difference in the US economy in 1950 compared to today. Right, there's a lot more people today. We can control for the population size by using real GDP per capita or per person. By dividing real GDP by a country's population, we got a good, albeit imperfect, measure of the average standard of living in a country. So once again, let's Google real GDP per capita Fred. Here's what we get. In 1950, real GDP per capita, measured in constant prices, was about $14,000. In 2015, real GDP per capita is about $50,000. So on average, people in 2015 have a standard of living that's 4 times higher than the people in 1950. That's a pretty big and a remarkable increase in the standard of living. By the way, since real GDP increased by 8 times and real GDP per capita increased by 4 times, we know immediately that the population approximately doubled between 1950 and 2015. Now let's take a closer look at this graph. We can see another reason why we're interested in the GDP statistic. Real GDP per capita declines during recessions. In fact, a decline in real GDP is part of what defines a recession. Declines in real GDP also tend to be accompanied by increases in unemployment. You can see here that when real GDP dips, the unemployment rate spikes. Now here's another nice feature of the Fred database. On the real GDP per capita graph, click Edit Data Series, and then switch to percent annual changes. So now we can see immediately the annual changes in real GDP. You can see, for example, the big recession in 2008 and 2009. In 2009, for example, the economy shrank by 3.6% compared to the year before. That's a very big and a very unpleasant decline. Okay, so now you've got your hands around real GDP as a way of measuring the health of our economy. And I said that real GDP per capita is a good, albeit imperfect measure of the average standard of living in a country. But is that really true? Does an increase in real GDP per capita mean that we're better off? That's the view that I'm going to defend in the next video.
If you want to test yourself, click Practice Questions. Or, if you're ready to move on, you can click Go to the next video. You can also visit MR University.
All right, so now we're going to look at the limitations. They're just going to talk about all the different reasons why GDP is not a perfect measure of standards of living, which we've already briefly addressed, but we'll take a look at this and see how it goes. And then when we're done with this, we can start chapter 6. All right, let me send this off to you. All right, let's check this out.
Antonio Soprano. This Friday. You gotta be good. Hey, Annette, this is Jacob Clifford, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Recently, several universities, including Princeton, Yale, and MIT, all reclassified economics as a STEM major. So instead of being part of the social science department with sociology, history, and psychology, economics is now part of technology, engineering, and math. So here's the big question. Is economics a science? Well, the answer is yes. No, kind of. It's complicated. At the highest levels, economics is basically applied mathematics and statistics, because making theories is important, but they need to be dissected, analyzed, supported, and rejected by looking at the data. So in that sense, economics is definitely a science. But it's hard to run controlled experiments in economics, and economists are notorious for making false predictions. So if the goal of science is to identify universal truths and to make infallible predictions that are always right, then economics is not much of a science at all. In the last video, I talked about GDP and said it was the most important concept in all of macroeconomics. I talked about what it is, how it's measured, and what it includes, but I didn't talk about its limitations. And there's a lot. In fact, the economist that developed GDP, Simon Kuznets, said the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. In other words, it's hard to gauge a family's standard of living by calculating something like the number of pies they can produce. In general, a family that can produce more pies than another family is happier and better off, but it depends on how many people are in the family, the size of each slice to each member of the family, and the quality or the taste of the pies. Measuring people's happiness by how much they can produce, their GDP has limitations. And to remember them, remember the acronym PIES, P-I-E-S. Limitation number one, population. The countries of Norway and Argentina have similar nominal GDPs, so you might assume the citizens of both countries have similar standards of living, but the population in Argentina is 8 times larger. So yes, they produce the same size pie, but Argentina's is being shared by more people. To solve this, economists calculate GDP per capita, or GDP divided by the population. This is the most common used measurement of standard of living, but it's not perfect. Why? Well, limitation number two, inequality. Even if 2 countries have an identical GDP per capita, you can't assume that all households in those countries have an identical standard of living. That all depends on how income is distributed, the slice of the pie that each household receives. So if 99% of the population is living in horrible poverty, GDP per capita doesn't account for that. By the way, I made this awesome episode of Econ movies where I talked about inequality in the movie Endgame. It's awesome. You should definitely check it out. Limitation number 3, the environment. A factory that billows pollution actually increases GDP. And so does cleaning up after oil spills and paying doctors to help people with lung cancer who smoke. GDP has no way of calculating the benefits of clean air or clean water and doesn't actually factor in the pollution from production.
Before Bill Travis knew it, he was covered with 5 pies worth of used blueberries.
And the reason why is because those benefits and costs are hard to value. They're subjective. It's just really hard to calculate the value of a tree. I love you so much. And if economics is a science, you can't have subjective things in there. You got to have quantifiable numbers and data. So if you destroy a forest to build a parking lot, that counts towards GDP, but you take some time off work to spend time with your family and go to the park, that doesn't count towards GDP. In fact, that would decrease GDP. Okay, limitation number 4, the last one, the shadow economy. If you buy an apple pie from the store, then that counts towards GDP. But if you buy it from your friend who grows the apples and bakes the pies herself, then that doesn't count towards GDP. This is an example of the shadow economy, the informal sector where people work and earn money, but it's under the radar. Technically, the shadow economy doesn't include volunteer work, household production, the sharing economy, or the black markets, but they're still all under the same umbrella. They all show the same idea. GDP doesn't include all economic transactions. Not all pies are being counted. Some pies are being made by people who are selling them under the table and the government doesn't know anything about them. Other pies are made out of love as opposed to for profit. Some pies are being used to barter for other things, and some people are making their own pies, and that's household production, doesn't count in GDP. And some pies are being made that are just illegal. I'm going to put all of these under the umbrella of the shadow economy. Okay, so how do we overcome all these limitations of calculating GDP and the actual standard of living in countries? Some people have suggested getting rid of GDP and using other measurements like the happiness index or the genuine progress indicator, the GPI. These don't just look at production, they include other things like the effect on the economy, equality, and the value of leisure time and family time. But again, the problem here is many of these things are subjective and they're hard to actually measure. So economists, despite its flaws, still use GDP per capita to look at standard of living. Okay, so what's the memory tool for the back of the wall that's going to help you remember the limitations of GDP? It is this, you guessed it, a pie tip. When you see this, remember that calculating standard of living is actually not that easy. It's not a piece of cake. I should have said piece of pie. I should have said piece of pie. Such a dork. Okay, don't go anywhere. Right now it's time for a pop quiz. No. Like always, I'm going to give you a few practice multiple choice questions to verify that you understand this stuff. Keep in mind, they won't be on the screen for very long, so you have to pause the video and look in the comments below for the answer key. Also, remember, I have something called the Ultimate Review Packet. It's totally going to help you learn and review and understand the concepts in your economics class. It's free to start right now. The link is in the description below. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video and my other videos. Until next time.
Okay. All right, so I guess, oh, we have another chat. Yeah, he's good. I use his videos all the time in my classes because he really is a very good at explaining this stuff. I think he's a teacher. As far as I know, I believe he teaches high school somewhere. So he's used to teaching this, and he's able to bring it down to earth basically without overwhelming us with math and statistics. And he tries to keep it funny too, you know, to the extent that's possible with this stuff. So yes, I do use a lot of his videos, and yeah, I mean, and it's also a lot of the it's like you're not going to forget this discussion about the pies. You know, it's going to stick in your memories. But he does explain to us very well why the measure itself has issues. And like by comparing Norway with Argentina, he reminds us that, yeah, the total output by itself doesn't necessarily tell us how high people's standards of living are, because we have to take into account the population, of course, but also industrial, you know, pollution, things like that also reduce GDP, although it isn't necessarily being counted. And like you said, sometimes there can be some very strange results. Like, for example, if a fire destroys a building and it's rebuilt, the value of the new building is counted in GDP, but the society hasn't actually gained anything because it lost the old building. So sometimes the numbers can be a little bit deceptive. But like you also said, this is the best thing we have, or the best tool to help us understand how well off we are compared to other countries, and our own situation compared to past years. So, all right, anyway, so let's get into the next topic, which is chapter 6, which is unemployment. Now, unemployment is always a controversial issue. This is one of those areas where the measurement is exceptionally difficult. Now, like we already know, for example, that GDP isn't perfect either. It has issues, but by comparison, the unemployment rate is extremely difficult to calculate. Now, here's part of the reason for that. At least with GDP, if a new car is sold for $25,000, that's what we add to the GDP accounts. There's no problem there. It doesn't depend on anyone's opinion. That car was sold for 25 grand, which means that's how much we're going to value it in the GDP accounts. Here, we're in a different situation because the question becomes, what exactly does it mean to be unemployed? And part of the problem here is that people who are not actually working might actually be looking for a new job, and other people who are not working may not be looking for a new job. And sometimes it's kind of a gray area who is and who is not looking for a new job. And so you get into these gray areas here that you don't get into with other areas of economics. And that does make the economist's job a lot harder. And in fact, because this is such a complicated situation, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which keeps track of this information, actually has 6 different measures of unemployment that it uses. 6, just to show you how much uncertainty there can be with these measures. One of them is designated as the official unemployment rate, the number that you hear about in the media. But there's 5 others as well, which have different amounts or include different situations in the unemployment rate. So this is one of those areas of economics where the numbers can be fuzzy, but again, it's really the best that we have. Obviously economists are constantly working on improving these measures, but it is a difficult thing to try to measure properly. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers this information through a survey. Now, here's another potential area of difficulty. They're not taking into account every single person who lives in the country. They couldn't do that. It would take forever. They get this information from surveys, and surveys themselves are not necessarily perfectly accurate. But this is the best they can do, because otherwise it could take a year to calculate the unemployment rate for March, let's say. So this is one potential source of problems. And so what they're trying to capture is how many people actually are working. And by the way, even here, this can be a touchy area, because what happens, for example, if somebody is working only 27 hours a week, does that mean they're fully employed? Well, it's hard to say. Maybe they're working part-time and they'd like to work full-time. So in other words, not all jobs are equal. Some people are not working, but they are trying to find a job. And some people are not working and they're not trying to find a job, or at least they're not putting much effort into it. And of course, there's other people who are not available for work at all. For example, college students. And then we have retirees, and we have, a lot of different categories, but this is the area where it's really tricky. How do you define actively looking for a job? If you've ever watched the show Seinfeld, you know that there's several episodes where George Costanza is in between jobs. And when that happens, he's never really working that hard at finding a new one. He doesn't really mind being unemployed, partially because he still lives with his parents. But there's a couple of episodes where, in fact, in one case, he was actually defrauding the Unemployment Bureau by pretending that he was working for some non-existent company, some kind of latex firm. You might remember that episode, but he was trying to game the system and get unemployment insurance as long as he could without actually having to work. And so somebody like that might not be considered unemployed because he's making such a weak effort to get a new job. But all right, anyway, so to be employed, this is what you have to have done. You have to have worked for either pay or profit. Now, there's a volunteer isn't going to get counted as being employed. Or if you're not getting paid, it has to be at least 15 hours a week for a family business. Like, that a lot of times people who own restaurants, their children end up working in the restaurant, or farms too. Often the children of farmers end up working on the farm. And this can count even if they're not getting paid, as long as it's a family business. All right, and sometimes you run into people where they're only out of work because they're sick, or they're in the hospital, or they're on strike or something like that. That's a little bit of a different situation, because the understanding is that they will be going back to work as soon as possible. All right, but again, you can see there's a lot of room for gray area here. Now, to be unemployed, obviously you're not working, but you must have actively looked for work during the previous 4 weeks. And the key word there is actively. It's hard to say what that actually means. And then what's really important is that if a job did come along, you would actually be able to take it. Okay, so that leaves out people who are, let's say, in jail or in the military, because they cannot just drop what they're doing and accept a job in the domestic economy. So they're not going to get counted as employed. Now, actively looking for work means things like calling up companies and asking if they have jobs, filling out resumes, filling out applications, going on the internet and looking for job openings, things like that. These are all the things that have to be done, by the way, if you're applying for unemployment insurance. If you're in between jobs, you're eligible for unemployment insurance, which is a payment that the state sends you every week. But you have to prove that you're actually looking for another job. Otherwise, you don't get a check. Okay. Hopefully that'll never happen to any of you. Or if you're now, some businesses are seasonal, and they may go through periods where the workers are laid off for a few weeks at a time before the new season starts. If you're in this situation, you're considered to be unemployed until you actually go back to work. So you would be eligible for unemployment insurance. So like, if you've ever seen that show, The Deadliest Catch, which is all about crab fishing in Alaska, the ships go out on a regular basis and fish for crab. But if, let's say, for some reason you did not get a job during a particular season, but you might get one during the next season, you could be considered unemployed. In other words, because you're available for work if it becomes available. Now, here we have to look at the overall population and make a distinction between the total population and the so-called working age population. And these are the people who theoretically could work if they wanted to. That doesn't mean they are available, but in principle, in order to be considered part of this population, you have to be at least 16, not in jail, not in the armed forces, and not in the hospital. Now, I don't know why they chose 16. You would think it would be 18, but I have a feeling that the reason why they say 16 is because theoretically, you could drop out of high school at 16 if you wanted to accept a job. Now, among all of these people, many of them are not going to go out and look for work. Obviously, for example, a large percentage of 18 to 21-year-olds are in college. And so while you're in the working age population, you're not available for work. And so what happens then is that we define among the working age population two groups: those who are in the labor force and those who are not in the labor force. Okay, so in other words, the working age population is everyone who could theoretically work. And then among the working age population, we break this down into two separate groups: the ones in the labor force, which means they're actively searching for work or else are working, and not in the labor force, which means they would not accept a job even if one became available. So let's see who's in each of these groups. So the labor force is people who are either working or who are unemployed but looking for work. Okay, so you are either working now or you're looking for work and would take a job if it became available. That makes you part of the labor force, all the people who are available to work. So who's not in the labor force? Okay, oh, and by the way, the unemployment rate is based on the size of the labor force, not the working age population and not the total population. This is only the percentage of the labor force who are looking for work. That's an important distinction, because you don't want to count people who would not accept a job even if one became available. We're only trying to figure out what proportion of those who are either working or looking for work are still looking. Now, oh, here we go. These are the people who are not in the labor force. Okay, these are people who are in the working age population, but not in the labor force. So obviously full-time students, no matter what job is available, you're not going to accept it because you're still in school. If you're retired, of course, that's the whole point of being retired. You don't work anymore. Homemakers. So if you stay at home with the children, and run the household, then you're not part of the labor force. You would not accept a job even if it became available. And then we have these people who essentially given up. All right, like George Costanza, basically. You don't have a job, but you're not in any hurry to find one. So you've decided, I've had enough of this. I'm just not going to work. Well, hopefully you've got someplace to live. But yes, that's defined as discouraged. You essentially have given up looking for a job. You could work, you just don't want to. So these are all people who are not in the labor force. And now, of course, back up here, remember we define the working age population in such a way that, yeah, I mean, if you're in jail or in the armed forces, you're not in the labor force at all. You're just not even being considered as part of this. You're not even part of the working age population. Okay, you're in a separate category altogether. So these are, again, working age population includes only people who could theoretically work. And then the labor force are the ones who want to work, and the not in the labor force are the ones who do not want to work. Even though they're eligible to work, they don't want to. All right, so yes, and I'm sure there's other categories that we didn't put in here, but for the most part, these are the people who are not in the labor force. Okay, and once again, as I said, the actual unemployment rate is just a ratio of the unemployed to the labor force, meaning it's the percentage of people who want work who don't have it. Okay, now you hear this number thrown around all the time in the media, the unemployment rate. But there's a couple of other measures that help us understand how the labor market is faring. It's just that the unemployment rate is the most popular one, but these other two are used as well. Unemployment, as I said before, is the unemployment number of unemployed over the size of the labor force times 100, which turns it into a percentage. So let's just quick example. If the working age population is 250 million people, the labor force is 160 million, which means there's 90 million people who are either students or retired or homemakers or whatever. Of those 160 million, 152 million have jobs and 8 million do not. So the unemployment rate would be calculated as 80 over 160, which is 5%. And that's how it's done. For all practical purposes, this is how it's done. Of course, there are other complications, but this is in a nutshell what they're doing. Now, let's take a look. As long as we're thinking about Fred, let's take a look at our unemployment. Now, the unemployment rate can change quite a bit, especially when we run into a crisis like the COVID or the housing crisis in 2008. Let's see what this thing looks like. Now you can see just before the COVID, the unemployment rate had fallen to 3.5%, which was the lowest since the 60s. So the economy was absolutely booming. And then pow, the COVID comes along. Unemployment rate got up as high as 13.3%. Now, luckily, it's dropping back to more normal levels, but it's still not quite back where we were before. Now, if you notice, these gray vertical bars all represent recessions. And so the unemployment rate always spikes up during a recession. Of course. Now, here in the 80s, this is at a time when the Fed was trying to reduce the inflation rate. The unemployment rate got as high as 10.8%, which is pretty high. But it didn't last for very long. And by the way, just to put this in perspective, during the Depression, the unemployment rate got as high as 25%, which is catastrophically bad. Even this is a nightmare. I mean, that's a lot of unemployment. But most of the time, the unemployment rate tends to hover around, let's say, 5% or so. If you averaged all these out, it would be somewhere in that neighborhood. Let's say 5% is about normal. And so again, policymakers try very hard to keep this as low as they can, but it's not always possible. You never know what's going to happen, like the COVID or this housing crisis. Something out there is always waiting to go wrong. And so we have these periodic recessions. It looks like they're coming roughly every 10 years or so, these catastrophes that come our way. There was a few more in the 60s in here, but it looks like it's about every 10 years that we're having a disaster. And so I guess that will always be the case. So that's our unemployment rate. Now, in some countries, the unemployment rate is higher. Let's say, let's take a look at France. Now you see their unemployment rate. Now look at this. Now this is France. They got down to about 8. Around the same time, we got down to 3.5. But look at these numbers. We've got 10 and only 7.5 here, but 12.4 and 12.275. Their unemployment rate is normally significantly higher than the United States. It's just, if you look at any stretch of time, theirs is typically higher than ours. And not by trivial amounts either. So you might ask yourself, why? What's going on in France? Well, part of the reason for this is because in France, the labor laws make it extremely. Oh, so I'm sorry, I missed this question. Wasn't the Great Depression the only biggest recession? It was the worst ever, but there were a few others that were almost as bad in the 19th century as well. So it just happened to be like by far the worst economic disaster we ever had. But there were some other ones that were pretty nasty in the 19th century as well. Hopefully we'll never see anything even close to that again. But anyway, so one of the reasons why the unemployment rate is so high in France is because the labor laws are very, very rigid. In other words, what I'm saying is that it's very, very difficult to fire people in France. So when you hire somebody, you better be serious about it, because you're probably stuck with this person potentially for the rest of their life. And so because of that, employers are very hesitant to hire new people unless they're positive that they'll work out. And so what that ends up doing is it causes unemployment to be a lot higher, just because it's just, like I said, it's almost impossible to fire anyone in France. And the effect of that, which they don't seem to realize, is that it's just going to make it harder for people to find jobs. I mean, if you could hire and fire people at will, you're going to take a chance on somebody. Say, this person might work out, they might not. Let's give them a chance and see what happens. If they don't work out, we'll get rid of them. That sounds cruel, but without that ability, who are you going to hire? You're going to have to be 100% positive before you hire somebody. And so naturally enough, you're going to hire less people. It's just, that's the way it is. In fact, many years ago, Bill Gates, when he was still running Microsoft, thought it might be a good idea to open a branch of Microsoft in France. And so we went over there and met with the government officials. And when he found out what the labor laws were like, he changed his mind. He said, okay, never mind. We're not going to do this because it's so rigid. It's like unbelievable how tough it is over there to get rid of people. And so this is what ends up happening. And, there's some countries where it's even worse, where like Greece, for example, it's not only impossible to fire people, but in certain professions, like, and I know this because I was told this by a Greek economist, like, for example, if you want to be a pharmacist in Greece, you have to have a family member who's already in the business. You can't just walk in the door and say, I want to work here. It's like, so everything is so heavily protected that to be a pharmacist or anything else in Greece, you have to already have had a family member in that business. I couldn't believe it when he said this. And so you can imagine their unemployment rate is through the roof. Let's see what we can come up with here, because it's like, what? The rigidity is beyond belief in their labor markets. No wonder they have so much unemployment. But that's the way they do it. Let's see what their unemployment rates look like. All right. Look at that. 27. That is where we were during the Great Depression, by the way. And even here, just before the outbreak of the COVID, they were at 16.475. Now here down here was a little bit better, but I mean, really, unbelievable. So this is why Greece is always in trouble financially. And in fact, they've had to be bailed out by Germany a couple of times in the last 10, 15 years. They were just in so much trouble. They had mountains of debt that they couldn't pay. They had a lot of unemployment. But we can discuss that later on when we start talking about the euro. But yes, the U.S. has one good thing. It has many good things, but one of them is we have very flexible labor markets. It's easy for people to get up and change jobs, to move to another part of the country, try something different. It's easy for employers to get rid of people who aren't working out. And you can change professions, you can change careers, you can do anything you want basically. And so that's one of the reasons why our unemployment rate is so low, because our labor markets are very flexible and very efficient. But anyway, so let's see what was next here. Oh, the other two measures of unemployment, we'll look at that later. I did mention that there are 6 different unemployment rates. We'll look at that next time too. We don't want to rush through this. So I tell you what, let's stop it right here with the unemployment, the employment population ratio, and we'll carry on from there. And in the meantime, next week, don't forget, we want to work on or next time rather, we want to work on the chapter 5 problem set. Okay, it won't be that long, but we want to get some practice calculating real and nominal GDP. All right, once you can do it once or twice, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so all right, so if there's no last minute questions, I guess we'll see you all then on Friday.
Thanks, Professor.
Okay, see you later.
Real quick, I wanted to know when the midterms would be.
Not for a while. Now keep in mind it's online. I mean, you'll be downloading it and doing it at home. So, and I'll give you like a week to do it. So there's no real rush, but soon enough we'll start reviewing for it. And once we've done that, then I'll post it, and then you can download it and do it at home. And I usually give about a week or so to do these online tests. It'll be just exactly what we've been doing.
Oh, okay. So when you release it, we have a week to complete.
A week or so, yeah.
Oh,
Or
wow,
maybe,
okay.
yeah, around a week. You shouldn't. I mean, these tests that I'm giving you were meant to be done in a classroom setting in like an hour and 15 minutes. So it's not going to take you anything like a week to finish it, but well, you know, you might be busy with other things. So that's usually what I end up doing with online classes.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay. All right. Okay. See you later. Okay. See you later.
Hi, Professor.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for
Hi.
class.
Hi.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm always learning. Thank you.
Good. Good.
You're always teaching. Yeah.
Good. That's what we want.
Sir, can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Did when you were in college, did you actually minor in economics as well?
No, I actually studied computer science when I was in college, and I realized pretty quickly that I didn't like it enough to keep going to graduate school. So when I went to graduate school, I chose economics, and I realized, yes, this is what I wanted.
Oh.
Yeah, so I made a switch. I was heading down the wrong path, although I must say having those computer skills is helping me, but I didn't want to do it for a living.
Oh, got you.
Yeah, so I don't regret it, but I mean, you know, I'm glad that I switched, but I'm not sorry that I majored in computer science because it's proven to be very helpful.
Well, thank you for sharing, Professor.
Sure, no problem.
All right. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow in class.
All right, see you then.
Bye.
All right, bye.